Hey there, TouchDesigner developers. DiLaura here with the Interactive and Immersive HQ. In this video, we're going to look at creating some fun minimalist geometric sculptures in TouchDesigner. We're going to take a little bit of inspiration from some actual physical sculptures of the past. We'll look at some techniques for generating similar sorts of geometry in TouchDesigner, and then we'll even cover some tips for taking your rendering to the next level by adding some things like a variety of materials as well as lighting options to really refine that look. So this will be a great opportunity for beginners who haven't yet really kind of experimented with some of the tools available for rendering and making things look cool. And also if you are, of course, interested in generating some different kinds of geometry. So with that, let's jump right into putting this project together. So to give you a little bit of inspiration as you are getting going with putting this project together, let's take a look at the work of Tony Smith, who has been one of my inspirations in putting this together. He was an artist working in the mid-20th century who is kind of most famous for these large-scale sculptures that are very kind of simple geometric forms and often are found in these very like matte finishes where everything is sort of a very perfect form with no seams visible or any sort of other marks of construction. Regardless, the kind of simple forms that these works are created out of and the angles of them was definitely something that I was thinking of as I was putting this particular project together. And Smith is a part of this larger group of artists working in this sort of minimalist style in the 1960s. And so there's plenty of other people that are making similar work to this at a variety of different scales and in a variety of different media as well. This is another one of Tony Smith's works according to the search engine. And again, just shows you how the same sort of minimal style can be applied in different ways to different types of work. So with that, let's head into TouchDesigner and we can start building our project. So we're going to start off with a blank network as usual and begin with some SOP geometry. So we're actually going to begin with the script SOP today, and we're not actually going to write any code, but we're going to borrow one of the handy operator snippets that are available for the script SOP. So first off, add that to your network and then go ahead and right click on it and we'll click on operator snippets. Once that loads up for you, we're going to go ahead and grab this fifth option on the bottom left here called custom parameters, which provides this kind of pentagon sort of shape. And we're going to go ahead and copy that as well as the callback script. So then I'll hit Control-C on the keyboard and paste that back into my project. And then I can actually get rid of the first script SOP because we're not going to use that one. So we're going to use this kind of pentagon shape as the sort of beginning the foundation of our final form. And we're going to essentially use a copy SOP to stack up a bunch of copies of this piece of geometry and then do some other things to it to create our sculpture. So this is, again, kind of, think of it like one slice out of a stack of slices of this shape. So we want to actually stack these slices of the shape up on the y-axis. So we need to essentially orient this particular shape in a different direction. And so we're going to do that with the handy transform SOP. So I'll add that in directly after. And then we need to simply rotate -90 degrees in the x-axis to, if we then take a look at the viewer, orient the top side upwards towards the y-axis in the positive direction. After that, we can go straight into the copy SOP, which we're going to use again to create a bunch of duplicates of this geometry. And now that we've got that added, let's go ahead and set our number of copies here to 9. Then we have the ability to transform the cumulative copies that we've created here. And so we're going to transform those by 0.5 in the y-axis, which will shift them upwards in space. And then we want to also rotate these around the y-axis by 50 degrees so that they are ever so slightly oriented differently as we kind of continue up this stack here. That is all that we have to do for this composition that we've set up, and then we're going to continue on with our next operator. So to take this from a stack of sort of flat planes and turn it into a three-dimensional shape, we're going to use something called the skin SOP, which, as you can see from the description there, it takes any number of faces and builds a skin surface over them. So we're kind of wrapping it and creating a 3D shape out of it. So we're going to leave the settings of the skin SOP alone and continue on to our next operator, which is going to be the convert SOP, which is going to allow us to take this piece of geometry, and we are actually converting it into a polygon for this next step. So again, we're going to leave this alone, and although it doesn't look like anything is really happening here, you might be able to notice that the outline has slightly changed, and it will come in handy for our next step. So we're going to add, after that, the facet SOP. And the facet SOP is going to allow us to basically take the different planes that make up, or the different faces that make up this piece of geometry, and split those up into independent shapes and give us this very cool faceted look. So to do that, now that we've added that into our network, let's turn on the unique points switch at the top, and then we want to turn on compute normals at the bottom, and we can turn on remove degenerate too, just in case. And now you can see that we've got this nice faceted version of our shape. However, we've still got a couple more things to do. So you might have noticed that this piece of geometry is sitting on the kind of x-axis, and that is okay for certain situations, but we actually want this to be centered with the center of this shape at the 0, 0, 0 midpoint of all these different axes. And so we're just going to use a handy shortcut via the transform SOP to do that. So go ahead and add the transform SOP, and then come to the post page where we're going to change the post translate X to origin, post translate Y to origin, post translate Z to origin, and there we now have a shape centered along all of those axes. From there, we're going to want to be able to correctly texture this piece of geometry. So we're going to use the texture SOP to add some UV coordinates for us, and that again can be left at entirely default settings. We also will need to create some normals and tangents for the particular type of material that we're using. So we've added an attribute create here, and then we've turned on the compute normals and tangents. So go ahead and do that now, and then we'll finish up with a null SOP. So assuming that you've got all of these different operators added into your network, I know it's a little bit more than normal, but we kind of have to get our geometry prepared for rendering and add in a couple of different things to make sure that the materials that we're working with will actually function. So that is it for our SOP geometry for this particular part of our network. We can go ahead and right click on the output of the null and add in the geometry comp to take this into our rendering pipeline. So for our rendering setup, we're going to need a material and of course things like lighting and cameras and all that kind of fun stuff as well. Let's go ahead and start with the material. So for this project, we're going to be working with the PBR material, which is a physically based renderer and allows for really nice and realistic materials to be applied to our geometry. So go ahead and add the PBR mat into the network. And we're also going to be working with the substance top, which is going to give us the ability to add in some really nice and realistic textures as well. But first of all, let's go ahead and drag this PBR onto the Geo1 and hit parameter material so that those two things have been connected. The next thing that I'll do then is to add in this substance top to the network so that we can modify the parameters within that and then continue on with our material, and then finally add in our rendering components as well. So substance top, let's add that to the network. And then we need to tell our PBR matte that this is the substance top that we want to use. So we can simply do that by dragging it onto the PBR matte and hit parameter substance top, which is the first option. We should see then that the kind of demonstration visual on the material and the geometry within our geo should turn this sort of gray, matte gray color. Let's head into the substance top for a moment, where we're going to make a couple of tweaks. So the substance top works with Substance Designer files, and it actually comes with a default sort of demonstration Substance Designer file that actually is pretty useful on its own. And if we click the graph drop down here, we have a number of materials that are available to us by default. And for our sculpture today, I wanted to use a metal material for that particular look. So I've gone ahead and clicked graph, the graph drop down, and then clicked metal to switch that to a metal material. And then you'll notice down here on the input values page, we have a number of settings which will modify the material that we have generated with the substance top. So on the input values page, we're going to do a couple of things. First of all, I don't want our metal to have any scratches, so I'm going to turn that down to 0. Then I'm also going to turn dirtiness down to 0 because I want kind of nice, clean, smooth metal. And then I'm going to set the input roughness here to 0.315, which again, you won't see super clearly at the moment, but when we render, that will make a difference as to how reflective this piece of geometry is. And then finally, the color that I want to use is a kind of light blue right about here in our color chooser. So you can try that or the teal one next to it. I think I'm going to go with this a little bit more in the blue direction. You can see then that our shape has changed color a little bit, and as well within this PBR matte, we also have some changes appearing there as well. Within that PBR matte, we've got a couple of things to tweak. First of all, I'm going to adjust the roughness here to 0.256, which, as you can see, makes that material more reflective and will, again, be more noticeable in the output. And that is actually it for this little portion of the network. So we've got all this stuff added that we can't really see our particular output of, or the outcome of the changes that we're making. So let's go ahead and set up the rendering pipeline to make all of this stuff function. So I'm going to add, first of all, the render top, because that's what is popping up first. We've got the render top. I'm going to add a null after that. The render top is likely telling us, yes, we need a camera in order for this to function. So for this particular project, I'm going to open up the palette with Control B or Command B if you're on the Mac, because we have a really handy built-in tool here called Camera Viewport, which I'm going to drag into the network, which basically allows us to have a camera view that we can click on with the mouse and then sort of pan around automatically. It gives us a sort of easy kind of turntable rotation style effect. So that is what I've added to the network. Now you'll notice that the render top has not made the connection to that being our camera, and that's because we have a default name in this camera's parameter. And so I'm going to go ahead and drag the camera viewport comp onto that camera's parameter, and you'll notice immediately we've got some changes there. Then we are going to need some lighting, because this is a material that is expecting there to be some kind of lighting in the scene. So I'm going to actually add 4 different total lights here today. The first one that we commonly work with when working with a physically based renderer is called an environment light, and it allows us to set up this ambient kind of environment lighting, which the PBR mat will use in its sort of rendered output. So the environment light actually also expects another operator, which is called an environment map. And as we can see here, it has no effect without that environment map. So that's actually an important part of our network. We're going to add that via the movie file in top. And again, we're going to use a demonstration file available in the TouchDesigner folders here because everyone will have access to it. So we've got that added to the network. Let's go ahead and click and drag that onto the environment one comp. I'm going to click parameter environment map. So for now we're using the banana, but let's head back to the movie file in top. Click the little plus sign next to our file parameter. And then we're going to scroll down in this set of demo content until we find this option right here, which is Palace of Fine Arts. And then I'm going to click open. So that's going to be our demonstration environment map. And you can see here in the rendered output, we actually have a close-up shot of the piece of geometry. So one thing that we can do now, we have this camera viewport operator. It has the ability to point to a specific render top. And now that we have that added into the network, let's go ahead and drag that into that camera viewport comp's render top parameter. You'll then see that show up in the background of that operator. And then if I click the viewer active in the bottom right, I can actually kind of move around, pan around our object. And if I click and drag, and I have to turn this function here on. If I turn on auto rotate, and then I click and drag in the viewer here and let go, you can see then you can set the scene here into a nice turntable style rotation so that we can see our piece of geometry from different angles. So we've got the basic sort of scene set up here. We are going to add in some additional lighting, but I think to really see the full effect of what that lighting is going to do, let's go ahead and add our other pieces of geometry in as well, which are going to basically be a plinth underneath this sculpture and then a box which will sort of act as the space that this is displayed in. So let's work on adding in our plinth. We're going to add a box SOP to the network, which is going to generate the geometry for the plinth. Here we're going to set the size parameters so that we've got 5 in the X size parameter, then we've got 0.1 in the Y size parameter, and then we've also got 5 in the Z size parameter. At the bottom, we're going to set the texture coordinates to face inside, and then we're going to add an attribute create as before, except all we need to do in this case is to compute tangents so that, or because we already have normals created by the box SOP itself. I'm then going to add in a null, and I will add in the corresponding geo comp, which is going to be called geo plinth. Just like before, we're going to need a material for this operator, and we're going to use the PBR mat again. We're also going to reuse, in this case, the substance top that we have up here, but then we're going to make some modifications to the PBR itself so that the material will kind of appear a little bit differently. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go ahead and drag the PBR mat onto the geoplinth and hit parameter material so that that is showing up within our output. And then we might have noticed, if you take a look now, that the positioning for that plinth is definitely not right. And we're going to correspondingly make some adjustments right now to the geo to set that up in the right position. So the translate that we need to modify here is translate Y, and we'll set that to -2.05. Now that is positioned correctly directly underneath our sculpture. So anyways, back to the material for this particular piece of geometry. I'm going to go ahead and drag the substance top onto the PBR like before. hit the parameter substance top option. And you can see then that we now have a matching base, which looks exactly like the sculpture that is sitting on top of it. So we don't want it to look exactly the same because we need a little bit of differentiation and kind of want to draw the eye to the sculpture itself and not to the base that the sculpture is sitting on. So what we're going to do is make some changes in the PBR material. And we're going to start off with the base color, which is currently set to white. If we tone that down a bit and set this to something like this dark gray right here in our color chooser, you can see that also correspondingly changes the color that it is displaying as in our render to a much darker gray and almost black, which is great. We're going to turn the metallic slider all the way to 0. And then we're also going to head over to the rim page where we're going to turn on rim lighting. For the rim lighting, we're going to set the rim center to 256. We're going to set the rim width here to 0.45. And then we're going to set the strength of the rim to 8.45. So very strong. What we should see then is that we have these kind of lit edges of this plinth, but the kind of top layer here is a nice dark gray color. So we've got the plinth added to the network now and rendering correctly. So let's go ahead and add our final piece of geometry, which is going to be the background box, which is going to create this kind of environment that our sculpture is going to be being displayed within. So I'm going to add another box op to the network. This time we're going to set the scale to -1. And then like before, we're going to add an attribute create. Actually though, come to think of it, we're going to use a different material. So we don't really need this attribute create this time around. We can just go straight to a null and add that to the network as well. Then I'm going to add in another geocomp, and this time we're going to name our geocomp to geobg box, background box. And then for our material, let's go ahead and use a Phong mat this time. We're going to again drag that onto the geo, hit parameter material, and then within the Phong, I'm just going to make a couple of changes before we head to the geo itself. So within the Phong, I want the diffuse color to be set to a, again, that same dark gray color as before, 0.2 in the RGB channels there. I'm going to move this shininess slider up to around 140. And then I'm also going to set the environment map color here to black. Then let's come back to the geo itself. We're going to use this to both scale and transform the position of this geometry. So I'm going to set the scale, uniform scale here to 30. And then I'm going to set the translate in the Y direction to 0.431. Now, what has that done? That has placed our piece of geometry here within that box, and we can actually see that it is slightly cutting off our view, probably due to the fact that the scale is not quite large enough. So I think what I'll do here is to bump up the X and the Y, or X and Z scale slightly once again. So I'm going to set those to 1.5. Let's go back and take a look. What we should see in our viewer now is that this is rotating and we don't see any of the box kind of clipping into or out of view. So you might have remembered that in the intro, we could actually see this box in the background, and it didn't just appear like we are seeing now as a kind of floating sculpture on, out in space or something like that. So we actually accomplished that in this case via the use of some additional lighting. And that is our kind of final step in this effect today. We're going to add in some some point lights and use those to apply some different kind of interesting and cool lighting to our scene. So let's go ahead and head back to the comp page where we're going to add in a light, and then we'll go ahead and copy and paste that a couple of times. Oops. We don't want to copy and paste the facet. We want to copy and paste the light. So I'm going to go ahead and add those in. And then as soon as we've done that, we can actually see that our box, although it is much bigger than it was before, the positioning of the box is slightly incorrect in that our sculpture is supposed to be oriented along the kind of bottom plane of this box. And the way that it is currently looking, we have a sculpture floating in the middle of this box. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on there before we kind of continue on. So what likely has happened, let's see here. The thing that we did incorrectly compared to how I had this done before is the uniform scale should actually not be applied here on the transform page, but on the pre-transform page. So let's go ahead and set that back to 1 on the uniform scale. And then we'll go to pre-transform, turn on the apply pre-transform, and set this uniform scale to 30. What we should see after that, if we take a look at our rendered output again, is there we go. Our sculpture is sitting on the floor or closer to it. It's a little bit hard to tell at this particular time. While we're at it, let's go ahead and set the transform scale parameters all back to 1, just because the uniform scaling may impact our final results. And then double check that we're not clipping. We still are clipping a little bit. So in that case, here's what we're going to do. You may run into this yourself. We can just take this pivot distance parameter in our camera viewport and shift that a little bit. Let's see if we can get this to, now that it's rotating, where we may have a little bit of difficulty with this. So let's do this instead. If we just go into our viewer here and zoom in a little bit on the sculpture itself, and then start it rotating again by clicking and dragging. Let's just double check that we don't have any clipping. And there we go. We still have a great view of the sculpture, but we avoid running into the edges of our box. So back to the lighting, which is again kind of the final step of our project today. We are going to do a number of things with these lights. We're going to move the position of the lights so that they're not all at the same location within this box. We're going to use them to apply some shadows to our scene, and we're also going to use them to actually light the scene using different color light. So to start, let's just focus on the simple positioning of things, and then we'll move into the other fun stuff like applying color and shadows and all that stuff. So for the first light here, this one we're going to leave at the default translation, which is what you see here, 0, 0, 10 in the translate parameter. And then we'll move on to the second one, which is going to be set to 0, 0, negative 10 in the translate parameter, which for now has kind of set us a little bit outside of our box, which is okay. We'll come back and fix that in a moment. For our third light, let's go ahead and set that to a translate of 5 in the X and 5 in the Z as well. Now for this light number 2, let's go ahead and shift this. Oh, I see. It's actually up against the wall a little bit. Well, that's okay because of the way that this is going to be set up in a moment. So we're good with all those transformations. Now let's go back and add in some color for each one of these lights as well. So for the first one, I went with, on the light page, the color of this kind of teal turquoise sort of look. So that's what I've done there. For the second one, I chose a kind of magenta color. So we'll do this one here. And then for the third one, let's go ahead and use an orange color. We'll use this one. And you can see here that that has added a little bit of color to our scene, which is looking cool. The next thing we're going to do is to change the particular type of light that these are generating. So right now they are point light, which is basically being projected in all directions from the particular point in space. And I actually want this to be a cone light instead. And for this first example, we're going to set the cone angle here to 60 degrees. Then we're going to head on to light number 2 and do exactly the same thing. Set this to a cone light and set our cone angle to 60 degrees. We'll come on to the third one here and set the light type to cone light, and then set the cone angle here to 135 degrees. And then if we look at our scene, we'll start to notice that things are looking a little bit different. It's not so evenly lit across the board. We're seeing things a little bit more kind of covered in shadow. It's a little bit more dramatic than before. We can also see the way that the light is shining across the floor from the cone that is generating it. And so we're almost there. The next step is going to be to add some shadows in as well. One thing to note is that if the addition of shadows, which we're going to do now, tends to slow your particular machine down, which it may, depending on the specs, you can always turn these off and, you know, have something that looks 90% of the effect that we're going for. So again, let's head into this first light, head to the shadows page. We're going to be using the soft 2D mapped option. Another option, if again you're running into performance issues, is to use the hard 2D mapped option instead. The soft 2D map option gives, as you might imagine, a kind of softer, smoother edge instead of a very hard, sharp edge, and thus can be a little bit more performance intensive. So anyways, we have the ability to manipulate a bunch of different things. So for the light size, this controls the size of the source light when using softer custom shadows. So we can basically increase the scale of the light. I'm going to set this to 0.1 for our first light here on the left. We're going to set the max shadow softness to 0.99. So very close to the maximum there. We're going to leave the filter samples and or actually, no, I take that back. We're going to up the filter samples in this case to 42 and the search steps to 59. Again, if either of these are slowing your machine down, you can always experiment with lower settings so that they don't cause as much of a performance tax. Now, what you might have noticed if you've been paying attention to the rendered output, especially once we rotate around our sculpture, is that we should be seeing some shadows on the wall, which have a little bit of a smoother edge, and the piece of geometry itself will, as we continue to kind of accumulate these different effects, have a little bit of sort of changes in its appearance as well. So let's head on to light number 2, which we're also going to head to the shadows page. We're going to turn our shadows to soft 2D mapped. We're going to set, actually, it looks like we've got pretty similar parameters for this one and the final one. So I think what we'll do here is let's go ahead and select both of these at the same time. I was assuming that we had an earlier version where they had different settings for each. So let's go ahead and select both of these, come back to the shadows page. We'll flip it off and then flip it back to 2D, soft 2D mapped for our shadows there. We're going to set the shadow softness to 0.98. We're going to set the filter samples to 37.5. Then we're going to set the search steps to 50. And with that, we should have something that looks pretty darn close to what we had at the beginning. So let's take a brief look at what we have done here and the kind of techniques that we're working with. We have first generated an interesting sculptural piece of geometry, which at its core is basically using a very simple flat plane pentagon shape, and then using the copy SOP and the skin SOP to turn that into a 3D dimensional piece of geometry. We've then used the facet SOP to give us these nice sort of faces to this piece of geometry and given us this cool faceted, like low poly look. Then we've taken that into our geo and kind of set up a rendering pipeline as usual, but the use of this substance top has given us the ability, if we take a look at our material here, to get a nice and potentially much more realistic kind of metal appearance to this shape. Now, of course, we can continue to tweak this, and this in itself is not necessarily the most ideal or perfect piece of geometry to apply texture to, but regardless, it has given us an outcome that is very, interesting and more realistic than what we might have generated with just a PBR by itself. Then we have added in some additional geometry to create and sort of set the scene. We have a plinth, we have a space around the object with which we can sort of reflect shadows onto and give a sort of space to our scene. We've used the camera viewport here just because it allows for this simple turntable-like functionality. And then importantly, for our substance and PBR based materials, we've got an environment light, which is used for calculating the kind of reflective properties of those materials. And then we're using, in addition, 3 separate cone lights in this case to spread some colorful light around the space and as well onto our sculptural piece of geometry. So obviously there are many, many things that you could do to tweak this particular project that we have put together. The first, of course, is playing around with any number of different operators in place of our SOP geometry. We don't have to have this particular input or use the copy stop. You could really, sky's the limit, modify this in as many ways as you want and get a completely different output. You could play around with the kind of space, the setting that we've set up for this operator, or for this scene rather. But one fun thing to do is to check out the substance top here and play around with the parameters, as well as take a look at the different materials that come with this kind of default Substance Designer file. You can also go online and search for Substance Designer files. There are some available for free on a number of different sites, which you can use and have, an even wider variety of realistic textures at your disposal. Another thing is to play around with different environment map files, which again, you can search for, and there are a bunch of them available open source online. And then of course, playing with the actual rendering and lighting that we have applied as well. Hopefully this has been an informative and fun little project for you to put together, especially if you're just starting to get into working in 3D in TouchDesigner, and has given you a little bit of a chance to play around with some of these operators that maybe you haven't worked with yet, like the substance top or this kind of wide array of SOPs that we've used to create this geometry. As always, we hope you've enjoyed putting this one together. Thanks so much for watching. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video here on the Interactive and Immersive HQ.
Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you like our YouTube content, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. The HQ Pro is the only comprehensive educational resource and community for immersive design, TouchDesigner, and creative tech pros. In the HQ Pro trainings, we cover almost any topic you can think of, and we go way more in depth than we do in our YouTube tutorials. We have a private group where Matthew Reagan, myself, and our other industry veteran and pioneer teachers answer your questions every single day. If that sounds cool, click the link in the description to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more free TouchDesigner and immersive content.